The ideas expressed in City Club forums are those of the speakers and not of the City Club of Cleveland, IdeaStream Public Media, or their sponsors. Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream Public Media are made possible by PNC and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland, where we are devoted to creating conversations of consequence that help democracy thrive. It's Thursday, May 1st. I'm George Jaskew, president of the United Ukrainian Organizations of Ohio, which, along with the Monday Morning Minion, set in motion discussions that catalyze this event. I thank John Dunn for introducing our groups, and David Goldberg for his relentless energy in keeping us on track. On behalf of both groups, I am honored to introduce today's forum and our esteemed speakers. As Russia's war with Ukraine entered a fourth year in February, several things happened. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky visited the White House only to be told by President Trump that, quote, he did not have the cards. Then the US began to pull back aid for Ukrainian forces. Shortly after that, Ukrainians secured increased support from European Union allies and continued to target Russian military and energy assets. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin hewed to his particular conditions for any ceasefire and intensified indiscriminate attacks against Ukrainian civilians' infrastructure. Yesterday, the United States and Ukraine signed a long-awaited mineral sharing deal. Geopolitics are complex and highly fluid. In the pages of The Atlantic, one of our speakers today, Johns Hopkins professor Eliot Cohen, weighed in, arguing that Russia is actually losing the war. He wrote, Ukraine has plenty of cards, even if Trump and Vance can't see them. Whatever and however it ends, the resolution of this conflict will have a tectonic impact on geopolitics and power dynamics at home, in Europe, and through the world. Today we are joined by two leading experts who will survey the landscape and discuss the prospects for enduring peace. Eliot Cohen is the Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategy at the Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington, D.C. In July 24th, he became Professor Emeritus at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies after teaching there since 1990 and serving as the school's 9th dean. He served in the U.S. Army Reserve and was a director in the Defense Department's policy planning staff. In 2007-2009, he was counselor with the Department of State, serving as Secretary Condoleezza Rice's senior advisor, focusing chiefly on issues of war and peace, including Iraq and Afghanistan. And I have it on good information that the professor has met and spoken with President Zelensky. Also joining us on stage is Paula Dobriansky, Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. She's a foreign policy expert and diplomat, specializing in national security affairs, and brings over 30 years of government and international experience across senior levels of diplomacy, business and defense. Dobriansky was Senior Vice President and Global Head of Government and Regulatory Affairs at Thomson Reuters and held the Distinguished National Security Chair at the U.S. Naval Academy. From 2001-2009, she also served as Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs. Meanwhile, also in our conversation is Quina Van Liet, CEO of the Cleveland Council on World Affairs and former political affairs officer in the Americas Division of the United Nations Department of Political Affairs. If you have a question for our speakers, you can text it to 330-541-5794 and also indicate your title or position. And City Club staff We'll try to work it into the Q&A portion of the program. Now, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Eliot Cohen and Paula Dobriansky.
Well, wonderful to see so many of you here to hear what our wonderful guest speakers have to say about Ukraine. And as was stated in the introduction, here we are in year 4 of Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. And was also mentioned, we are now in the middle of what has been the most concerted effort to achieve a ceasefire since the war started. And yet, we still have a lot of the same questions that we had 3 years ago. How does this war actually end? What does this mean for Ukraine, for Russia, for Europe, for the United States, and for the global community more broadly? So we will get to these questions. But where I would like to start our conversation this afternoon is asking our speakers to provide a little bit of context as to how we got here in the first instance. And so starting with Ambassador Dobriansky, could you please remind us what this is all about? Why did this war start? What are the root causes that President Putin seems so fond to be referring to these days? And also, if you could just remind us as Americans, what were the stakes for the United States when this started in 2022?
All right. Well, first, if I may, I'd like to thank the City Club and Dan and all of its members. It's an honor to be here and to be back in Cleveland. And also thanks to the initiative of David and George in bringing us here with the concept of pairing us up. And so I'd like to express appreciation and looking forward to the exchange. When I begin my answer to my question, I would like to say, you mentioned 4 years. Most look at it as 14 years. So Ukraine was invaded in 2014. And to put it in context of how we got here, I'd start with the Munich Security Conference in 2007, when Putin used the occasion of speaking at the Munich Security Conference and literally rejecting Western values, asserting himself and saying that I have a right and we have a right to invade and engage anywhere that any Russian and Russian speakers are threatened. So he laid a marker, and he literally laid a foundation, I believe, into what he was about to do. I'd say one lesson learned right up front from that was that we didn't really take heed of his words. We didn't take it seriously. Fast forward, I would look at how we handled Afghanistan. And during the the Obama-Biden administration, I start with that, because during the handling of it, and basically Afghanistan, but let me come back to, during 2014, because with the first invasion, during Obama-Biden, at that time, the Ukrainians had asked for military assistance, for javelins. And the administration said, no, we're not going to provide you Ukrainians with any assistance in your attempt to fight against the Russians. And then actually it was also stated, we're not only going to not give you the javelins, but secondly, we also, if you decide to go ahead and to fight against the Russians, we're not going to give you the kind of financial assistance that you have sought from us and that we've been giving. So forgive me, I meant to mention that first before I go to Afghanistan, because that's a crucial signal. Putin certainly took note of the fact that Obama-Biden, and I'm underscoring Biden here, that no arms were given. And this rejection of assistance, of help, and concern, obsession and concern about escalation. Then Afghanistan in the mix here, and the handling of it, the fact that in Afghanistan, a vacuum was left. And I think where Putin is sitting in Moscow, his disposition is, well, look at this. The United States is out of there, and the United States decided to just abandon, move out, and for whatever the reasons, the signal to him was, I have carte blanche. So then he did move in. And I believed he moved into Ukraine because he believed he could do it, and do it with minimal consequences. And there was another key factor here that I think I could attest to, I actually was part of a letter writing group the year before Russia invaded. And Republicans, Democrats, independents, all of the above, we all signed a letter to then President Biden saying, we are very concerned, we believe, with the tanks lining up at the border, you need to do something. You need to take military action, or you need to also impose sanctions, economic sanctions. And there was an argument over deterrence. And the administration's position was, that's not necessary because the Russians know that we're going to take action and we've stated what we're going to do. We argued, no, they don't respond to that. You have to do it, not say it. And in the end, the tanks moved in. So there were a number of, I think, very critical lessons learned. You asked me what led up to it. Those were the factors that led up to it. There were unfortunate signals about a willingness to actually take military, economic, strong action in this case. And a final point I'd say is, I think that Putin also believed that actually our relationship with Europe at the time was fragmented. And in this case, again, that he could take this action and actually get away with it, that there'd be minimal, if any, kind of consequence.
Well, speaking of the military realities of this conflict since 2022, Counselor Cohen, Professor Cohen to me, as was stated in the introduction, you know, what we get as Americans reading the headlines, this is essentially a territorial conflict that has been stalemated along a border that goes over 1,000 kilometers, and that essentially the momentum is on Russia's side right now. Do you agree with that assessment? What are we missing here? And how would you like to sort of set the record straight for how we got here?
So first, I'll echo Paula's thanks. I just want to say it's a particular treat to be here with somebody who's not only a colleague in government, but a graduate school buddy of mine.
Yes.
And on the right, Karina, who was a student at SAIS while I was teaching there. So that's a real treat. No, I think the thing we have to begin with, of course, is what did Russia want to get out of this war? Well, what Russia wanted to get out of this war was either the total occupation of Ukraine, but at the very least, the destruction of its form of government, the annexation of large parts of it, if not all of it. In many ways, the restoration of the Russian Empire, and certainly the obliteration of a democratic government. So it's failed in all those things, and dramatically so. It further, I think, wanted to kind of push NATO further back and weaken it. So instead, you've got two very formidable countries, Sweden and Finland, that are now parts of NATO. And of course, the war itself has been a debacle for Russia, with something near 1 million casualties, something like as many talented young people having fled the country, and actually a lot of economic damage that underlies that. You know, they say figures about the increases in Russian GDP are profoundly misleading, because you can generate a lot of GDP by manufacturing trillions of cinder blocks. It's just that nobody's ever going to use them, but you know, the way the statistics work, it'll look as if you're actually increasing your GDP. Russia's economy is in big trouble, and I think this is one of the reasons why, as you look further out, particularly towards next year, that's actually the crisis point for Russia. The way to think about the war, I think, is it's a number of different parallel campaigns. I'll talk about the land battle last. First, there's a maritime campaign, and Ukraine has won that maritime campaign. Ukraine can export agricultural products, which are critical for its economy, just about at the pre-war level. That is a remarkable achievement. It's done that by sinking, depending on who you want to listen to and what you want to count, 30 to 40% of the Black Sea fleet. So that's one part of war. There's a second war, which is sort of the technical term is a ranged war, so a deep war of deep strikes. Now there, of course, Ukraine has been very badly battered by Russian attacks on its cities. However, the lights are still on. Ukraine is extraordinarily resilient. We can talk about why that's the case. And the Ukrainians have actually been able to dish it back, but in a much more focused way, particularly going after the Russian oil industry. And even beyond that, there is a kind of covert warfare campaign that goes on, which includes the assassination of generals in Moscow, which is a very big deal from a psychological point of view. And then, of course, you have the battle on the front line. I think there the thing to remember is it's always a good idea periodically to look at the news reports over a period of time and see how many times the imminent fall of some village somewhere has been billed as a disaster. And usually the village or the town has not fallen. The Ukrainians have done really quite a remarkable job. The Russians are making very slow incremental gains. And when I say slow, I mean like a couple 100 meters a week or something like that. But at a horrific cost. And behind all that, what you've seen on the Ukrainian side in particular is an explosion of the Ukrainian defense industry. And that's actually another kind of campaign, if you will. So there, roughly about 30% of Ukraine's military hardware now comes from the United States, 30% from Europe, 40% is indigenously manufactured. It's very high quality. A country that had no or virtually no drone manufacturing is manufacturing over 4 million a year. I think it was 1.5 million last year. And this is technically advanced stuff. It's doing it with the technical assistance of European countries like Britain. And so just on the kind of innovation competition, the Ukrainians are doing well. Last thing I just want to say about the military campaign and where it's going. Most wars usually end in some sort of surprising collapse. And frankly, it's foolish to try to predict how a war is going to end. The European powers thought World War I was going to end maybe in 1919, and then in September, October, November of 1918, everything fell apart. Particularly with an authoritarian regime of the Russian type, there's a lot that happens under the surface. I think Churchill once said that Russian politics is like watching a bunch of cats fighting under a rug. You know that there's something going on there, but you're not sure what. The Prigozhin coup attempt was very revealing, I think, though, which was, there was basically no opposition to it whatsoever. And I think this is actually one of the biggest concerns for Putin. I mean, by and large, as Fred Starr, who also teaches at SAIS and is a great Russian scholar, points out, most Russian rulers go out, haven't been killed, or at least deposed. And I think he has to be thinking about that. Unfortunately, and this is the last thing I'll say, the implication there might be that it's better for him to have a war go on than for the war to stop. Because if the war stops, that's the point at which the questions begin to ask. 1 million casualties for, even if they retain the territory they've got, for the devastated landscape filled with mines, a bigger NATO. Even if sanctions are lifted, companies are not going to go rushing back to Russia. One lesson we learned in the Bush administration is it's easy to put sanctions on. It's actually very difficult to take sanctions off in a meaningful way. So that's the one kind of downside of all this. I think from Putin's point of view, there may be less risk in continuing to prosecute the war than in stopping it. And I believe that's one of the reasons why the Trump administration is frustrated that it keeps on offering them great deals and they're not taking them.
Well, speaking of the deals, so here we are, spring of 2025. Ukrainians have shown tremendous resilience, and Russia not winning as much as it purports to. And we have this flurry of diplomatic activity and all these ceasefire proposals, obviously the Trump administration's proposal, but the Europeans also working on proposals. Could you share with our audience what are some of the specific elements in those proposals and what's in it for Ukraine and Russia and what the issues are there with the proposals that are on the ceasefires that are on the table?
Well, I'd begin with actually the very first ceasefire, if you don't mind my going to that, because it's worth knowing actually that Zelensky and Ukraine, when they were invaded, in Turkey, Zelensky's foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, was sitting down with Lavrov, and they were discussing a ceasefire. By the way, early on. The Ukrainians had wanted, actually, themselves to put terms on the table and actually broker a kind of a deal then. Well, the one good thing then, they did not stop fighting. And by the way, that's been a tenet of any of these ceasefires, meaning the Ukrainians, because they were, of course, protecting themselves from the onslaught and the continued barrage of attacks coming in from Russia. But at the time, why I mentioned this to you, that this happened early on, the Ukrainians really tried to broker that kind of a framework and to actually discuss, let's go over our differences, see if we can work something out. And we already know what happened after that, as you mentioned, for these last 4-year period of this new or continued invasion, that basically there hasn't been a ceasefire respected. So fast forward to the current back and forth. I don't even know how to define it. I mean, because it seems, forgive me, it seems like it changes at every moment. Yeah. The Russians weren't respecting it. Then they said that there would be a kind of a half measure. I don't know what that means. Either you have a ceasefire or you don't have a ceasefire. So I think the fact, at least to take away here, is the Ukrainian side has been very transparent, very agreeable in its willingness to have a ceasefire, to have a full discussion of how one goes forward in this context. Whereas on the Russian side, and this picks up on Eliot's point about, as you mentioned, various Russian authoritarian and totalitarian leaders that come forward and are desirous of extending a war, a conflict, and they don't want a resolution. And here, I don't see that really Moscow and Putin are seeking really a genuine resolution. The only resolution that I see is they want the end game, and the end game is specifically to literally maintain everything that has been seized, everything that has been invaded. They have other terms about Ukraine must not go into NATO, et cetera, et cetera. So towards that end, I don't see, and I haven't witnessed any kind of move on their part. Let me mention one other detail that I think is important here. Eliot mentioned the issue of NATO. I went back to the Munich Security Conference, and you were probably there at that moment when Putin was speaking. It's an important detail about this usage of NATO. Preventing Ukraine, not having Ukraine, that was one of the original pretexts used. And by the way, it was also even used with Finland and Sweden, and where there was nuclear saber rattling. And by the way, you haven't heard anything about that. But I'm going to move that over here for a moment. Why? Because this is a detail that's also worth knowing. Zelensky, right at the very beginning, he actually went back to Putin and said, this is at the beginning of this particular aspect of the conflict, said, we are not seeking to be in NATO now. So let's work out an arrangement. We don't have to be in NATO now. Zelensky offered that. On the Russian side, instead of Putin accepting that as kind of a midway, he came back and he said, no, you have to codify in your constitution, no, never, you will never go into NATO. And that's when Zelensky drew a red line and said, no, I'm sorry, we're a sovereign country. I'm willing to not bid for NATO membership, but I'm not going to accept these terms. So, as you asked that question, I'm not giving a more specific picture because it's almost like, on the Russian side, just moving along and moving along. Right. On the Ukrainian side, it's been very clear from the start. They wanted a ceasefire at the beginning. They took their own initiative on that. Turkey was brokering it at the time. And then right up to the present time, in terms of terms, they've tried to satisfy and to come to some kind of term here, and there just hasn't been any there.
Well, and the question it raised for me is, as you said, the current effort seems to be driven a lot by the United States. So I'm wondering, Eliot, what is the U.S.'s strategy here? What are we trying to achieve?
Yeah. So it's The word strategy is not usually the word that
Fair point.
I associate with this administration. I mean, it's hard enough in the kind of administration that Paula and I just served in a number of years ago, or the previous, where you can say there's a comprehensive worldview here and people are trying to somehow negotiate their way through. I guess here's what I think about President Trump is really the only one who matters here, because there isn't, I think, one thing that's really important to understand, we were just chatting, there's what looks like a pretty good rumor that the president's about to fire his national security advisor and his deputy, like this would be barely 100 days into the administration, which is a little bit unusual. There is no process. The way the United States government makes policy, as we well remember, is you have all these nested committees, and particularly we were both served on the Deputies Committee, which kind of teased things up for cabinet secretaries. It's usually a pretty rigorous process, and it guarantees some kind of coherence, usually. As far as I can tell, there is no process here at all, which means that it's just sort of the emanation of Donald Trump's id. And I think, so then the question is, what do we think that Donald Trump thinks? And your guess is as good as mine, but I guess here's what I tend to think. First, I think he does sort of dislike Zelensky personally. Some of this is tied up with his view of Hunter Biden and all kinds of stuff. He has historically had a kind of respect for Vladimir Putin. I don't interpret that as being in Putin's hip pocket, actually. I think most of the president's relationships are highly transactional. And although at one level he admires tough guys, Putin's a tough guy who's kind of screwed up a lot, as he has pointed out, by getting into this war. I think sort of the value side of this doesn't matter to him. But I do take seriously the idea that he finds the carnage appalling. I mean, there have been indications in a number of places that he, so for example, going back to the first term, when we attacked Syria after use of chemical weapons, that what the reporting suggested was that seeing images of kids who had been gassed really set him off. And so I think here he does have that. But I think the most important thing to know about this is a guy in his second term. He's risen from the dead twice politically and having gotten nicked by a bullet. And I think and most presidents have grandiose self-conceptions in their second terms anyway. And so the result is, I think he has a conception of himself as a great peacemaker. And, that helps explain, I think, the craving for a deal not only in the Middle East, but also with Iran. Even though the Iranians tried to kill him, he wants a deal. I think he wants a big deal with China. So I think he will push for all those things. And beyond that, it's, as the psychologist William James once said, a buzzing, blooming confusion.
May I add on that? I'm going to describe it just a little bit differently, okay? In this case, and let me explain. I think I'd start with the fact there is consistency here because Trump has taken the position for a long time he was against the war in Iraq. You and I served in government in that time. Actually, as Eliot mentioned, in the George W. Bush administration, Trump was against. He was against then, and he's been very consistent on invasions. And I think that's also part of, if I'll use it in the context, you use the word strategy, his view has been, and he campaigned on this, and so then the consistency with the campaign, that he wanted to bring an end to the war in Ukraine. But also as part of that is the issue about us, that not having American blood and treasure abroad. And that's also part of the Afghanistan legacy in this, that we need to, that's where the term America First. We need to devote our monies, our funds, our resources here in the United States. That doesn't mean that we can't engage internationally, but we shouldn't be mired in conflicts. And let's be judicious as to how we use our funds, how we use our resources. The third element that I'd put here is I think he genuinely does care, as you mentioned, about the loss of life. He's mentioned that just in recent days when Putin totally discounted the ceasefire, appeal for ceasefire. And you know, there was the barrage and the very severe attack and loss of life in Kiev itself. He made a statement, Trump made a statement, and condemning Putin, saying, we're going to impose sanctions, we're going to take other actions, because here, you know, obviously you're not caring at all about ceasefire or the loss of life here, and that I do. So I'd say that is part of this mix. And also I'd put in the mix as well that there's been actually something that Eliot and I have dealt with for a long time, because from different presidents, is where does Europe come into play? And I have to put this on the table because this is another piece for Trump and Trump's, you know, policy view and vision. He has believed that, you know, Europe never stepped up to the plate. I remember Mattis, actually, when he was Secretary of Defense, he came forward and he said to the Europeans, are you not willing to put up monies for your own defense? And you're telling us that we care more about your future generation than you do? And so here, that's another piece of this, if you will, strategy or, you know, view, basically that it's not the United States who should be underwriting. Here, it's we have a stake in it, and I think there's been recent action that shows that there's an interest in the correlation with our security, but that where is Europe? And what I was saying, Eliot and I have witnessed every president in recent time, Republican and Democrat, has tried to push Europe.
Yeah, Bob Gates was saying the same thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And by the way, it's always been done very nicely. And so Trump really brought it to the edge and said, you know, we're going to get out of NATO, you know, if you are not, you know, actually stepping forward. So I wanted to put it also, if I may, in that context, because there are some elements here that I think play into the policy approach. And I'll end on this note, this question on this note. I also think that Trump is very committed to having success here and really getting this over the line. And I think that's been part of this give and take of trying to really get it over the line. But you know what I took note of? He himself said two things. One that he said, and I want to make a comment he said about Zelensky. So one thing that he said very specifically when he became president, he said, you know, I'm worried. Actually, I think the situation and resolving the situation in Ukraine is going to be harder for me than the Middle East. He actually repeated this several times. But the other thing I wanted to mention, I might dispute his view on Zelensky, and you know why? Because he actually came out, and he repeated this several times. And think about, he's a former businessman. He said that Zelensky is the #1 salesman on earth. He said something like that. And when I heard that, I thought, you know what? He admires him. He admires his skills.
Look, I mean, he's erratic. And that's why I think, no.
Transactional, as they say.
I think it's very important because I think, you know, what you and I have been doing is sketching out a worldview, right, which I think he has. So where he is one day to another, I mean, I write regularly for The Atlantic, and as you all know, my editor, Jeff Goldberg, found himself engaged on a signal chat where all good war planning happens.
And then he went to the Oval Office.
Right.
He just was in the Oval Office.
Well, but that's my point. So, you know, in the immediate aftermath of that, Trump called him a horrible left-wing lunatic. Now, Goldberg immediately reported that his children said to him, "You're not left-wing." But then he invites him to the Oval Office, and so I think that's, you know, part of whether it's deliberate or just like the way his mind is hardwired, he will go back and forth between, you know, that meeting, which was abusive, it was disgraceful, on the one hand, and then, you know, there they are chumming around in the Vatican.
I'm going to ask one quick final question and give the audience the time to come up with all the burning questions I know that you have to ask our speakers. But just very quickly, speaking of worldview, just to put the conflict in Ukraine into context for sort of American geopolitical concerns, really quickly, a minute each of you, how does this fit into sort of our broader way we act and our security interest on the global stage?
You want to go first?
Okay.
This time? Go first. Go second.
Look, so first, it means that war is back in a big way. I mean, this is the kind of conflict that nobody has really expected, a really massive war in Europe. It has implications, by the way, for the conduct of war. That's a separate, more technical issue. And it does fundamentally raise the question of Europe together with all the other things that the administration has been doing. And I'm headed out to Europe actually next week. I'll be really curious to see. The sense I get is actually, the European self-conception is changing somewhat as a result of this, and there's going to be movement. So I think we may be at a kind of watershed in our relationship with our European allies as well.
I'll say two things. I'm headed to Europe as well, to Barcelona and to London. And in both cases, I'm looking forward to hearing the perspective. Yeah. But I'll add on to that. I see two things in this shift, if you will. One is the interconnectedness of the arenas. And that is that many are looking at what happens in Ukraine and the Asian countries. Japanese Prime Minister, the Koreans, all are saying, and with the focus on Taiwan especially, what happens in Ukraine has great ramifications for us. And you saw historically the Japanese have upped their defense, the Koreans very engaged. So I wanted to mention that. That's really come more to the forefront. And the other piece that I'd mention is interesting. Eliot's more the expert on the nuts and bolts of hardware, military hardware technology. But I'm very struck by, the creative use of intelligence that was at the beginning of this war, that really hadn't, where our CIA got engaged. I thought that was significant. And the other piece that I'd also mention here is not only that, but also warfare training. You mentioned the drones, something which the Ukrainians are very proud of, their own manufacturing on drones, and just how warfare is conducted. We've been learning a lot from this as well.
So we're going to transition to the audience Q&A. My apologies to all of you that it's a little shorter than normal. For our live stream audience, I'm Karina Van Vliet, CEO of the Cleveland Council on World Affairs, and today we are talking with Eliot Cohen and Paula Dobriansky about Ukraine and the prospects for peace and its future as a sovereign nation. We welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, as well as those joining via our live stream at cityclub.org or other media outlets. As was said in the introduction, when you ask a question, it would be lovely if you could introduce yourselves, say your names. Our speakers would love to know who you are. And as Dan said, if you're shy and you need to text your question, the number is 330-541-5794, and the wonderful City Club staff will try to work it into the program. Do we have a first question over there?
Yes, I'm going to ask one of those text questions that our audience has already been sending. How would you explain in clear and simple terms why supporting Ukraine matters to the average blue-collar worker in the U.S.? Why should they care about this war, and how do we get the message out given the current state of our partisan media?
I think that we need to remember that what starts in Europe doesn't stay in Europe. This is not the first time the United States has encountered this kind of world. The pity of it is we've lost the World War II generation who learned this the hard way. And we may be in a position to learn it the hard way as well. I hope not. What we've been doing is, without losing a single American life, for a very small fraction of our defense budget, to very substantially weaken a country that is deeply hostile to us. Why wouldn't you do it?
I will add a footnote to that because we are in Ohio. Mark Thiessen wrote, he's a journalist, and he did research on this very issue of the war, and in particular, our manufacturing, because you said you're blue collar. If you look at this and look it up, he literally gives the details about how many of the factories here in the state of Ohio actually that workers are benefiting, and the United States is actually benefiting from what we're doing and what we're contributing to actually the war. So I would urge you to take a look at that particular. So I'm giving a fast answer, but Mark Thiessen, Thiessen.
Let me just add, I mean, one thing people need to remember is the money that has been spent in Ukrainian aid is mainly spent in the United States.
Right. And that's in his piece, exactly.
Yep.
He demonstrates what is being produced and then what actually is the benefit here in terms of not only income, but actually employment.
Yeah.
I appreciate it's difficult to figure out President Trump's motivations for things, but I think it's very clear that that he views China to be the #1 geopolitical and economic threat to the United States, which is something he's been talking about for many, many years. So how much of his effort to bring peace to Ukraine, how much of that is motivated by getting Putin on our side so that the world can gang up on China? Thank you.
Some have argued that, if I may, that's a thesis that is going around about using sort of the Nixon reverse in this case. I'm not sure that that is part of the thesis. It's out there. I do think that you're absolutely correct. In terms of the administration and in terms of bipartisan support, there is a lot of concern about China's motivations. You heard me mention the views of those in Asia. They've come in to meet President Trump, and that's top of their agenda. The concern where you have a Japanese prime minister talking about publicly and privately, we are concerned of this outcome. So my answer is, I think it's factored in here, but I think that I tried to give you a feel for what I think is first and foremost in terms of his own calculation, which he's looking at a consistent position he's had for a long time about wars and not engaging in wars, about how we use our military assets and blood and treasure, and then no less, here in this case, I think that he believed that his relationship with Putin, that he would be able to get traction. And he's witnessing how obstinate Putin is at this point.
It's also a very important historical point. The Sino-Soviet split happened not because the United States very cleverly inserted a crowbar in there and pried them apart. Those countries were on the verge of war. The Soviets had, in fact, approached us about the possibility of a preemptive strike on the Chinese nuclear program. They had actually been killing each other along the Ussuri River. I mean, there was serious fighting. So it's not that the United States, as clever as Henry Kissinger was, I knew Kissinger quite well, with all due respect to the president, and Marco Rubio, they're not Henry Kissinger. But the point is, first, well, among other things, it would be stupid to go around saying, yeah, we have a great idea, we're going to split the enemy alliance. That's not the kind of thing you would broadcast if you actually intended to do it. But the point is, the initiative was as much on the Chinese side because there was fundamental underlying hostility. Here there isn't. And here there isn't in part because they both fear, with good reason, liberal democratic contagion. I mean, both countries are threatened by that. And then, I mean, there are other arguments you could go through, but the complementarity of their interests are very real. So I think this notion that you can lever the two apart is chimerical. It's just not going to happen.
I'll just add a footnote, not about Trump, but for the future, because I've actually written on this issue about the Russia-China relationship now, just in analyzing it. It is close because their goals and objectives are the same: diminishment of U.S. position and influence internationally, and also fragmenting our alliance. They work very close together, but there's always been a traditional split there, just culturally, historically. I don't know how long that will last down the road. Medium term, short term, medium term, yes. Longer term, I don't see it as something that's tight.
My question for you is that historically, Republicans have been anti-Soviet Union or Russian. And we even changed French fries to freedom fries when the French wouldn't go along with us. But how come the Republican Party today has become such a big in love with Putin and the Russian state?
You're looking at two politically homeless people on this stage. I mean, at least that's how I identify myself. No, I was a Republican. I mean, and happily so, of the kind of New England Republican tradition. Paula, you've probably got a better feel for this because I just threw up my hands and sleep on a grate.
I'm not there, okay? All right, but I think what you have first, let's talk politics. I think that our Congress, as you've witnessed, have taken a strong position and stance in supporting the administration generally. And I think part of it is, honestly, I think they want to see how this unfolds. And there are pieces that some may have concerns about and differ with, but they want to see how it unfolds. And I'll say this, we were discussing in the green room, I personally think there are three news of the day that are positive. I think the deal, the minerals deal, I'm pointing to George, we were discussing it. I think that's a good thing. Why? Because that minerals deal is going to ensure that the United States is engaged in Ukraine. It's not going to be moving aside. It's not engaged militarily, but it is engaged, and that's key. And they took out, it's off the table, it was cited, Zelensky, the second. Zelensky actually got what he wanted, which was Ukraine is not paying, for the monies that already have gone from us to them. So that's off the table. So it's a deal that's going to be a good win for Ukraine. Ukraine has sought to modernize. Then let me mention that I noticed that Europe and Ukraine have come forward, and they've come forward actually in stating that they are going to have defense monies on the table, and that's a good initiative for the EU. It formally made an announcement, which it was wavering on. And then also the Department of Treasury just came out and said, Besant, the Secretary of Treasury, we're going to give monies and have a fund for reconstruction in Ukraine. So I see all of those as very positive movement, and definitely in terms of support for Ukraine. I think that you have to look at everybody individually. Not everybody has favored or embraced every single piece here. I think people are waiting to see how this unfolds. So let's see. That's going to be kind of my answer on this one, because I'm very steeped in these details. And, I could take a position, well, I maybe like this, I didn't like that. I'm someone who is a strong proponent of wanting to see peace, definitely, this coming to an end, that also it's not peace at any cost, too, in this case.
I'll just say, I hope you're right. I really do. I think part of what motivates the congressional part of the Republican Party is fear. Fear of being primaried, fear of some, in fact, one of the senators said, Lisa Murkowski, I said, literal fear. But, when I look at the polling data for Republican views on these things, it is not the internationalist Republicans that I remember. It unfortunately taps, there are other traditions in the Republican Party, and some which were always isolationist, which had, to my mind, much more integrity. The sort of Robert Taft, actually. But that since Eisenhower, that has not really been where the Republican Party was. And for sure, on the American right, whether we want to associate that with the Republican Party or not is a separate question, and I think reasonable people can disagree. On the American right, there is a kind of sympathy for authoritarians, and that includes Putin, it includes Viktor Orban. And I find that very troubling. Now, I'm equally troubled by stuff that I see on the left, but I think it's part of the situation of our times, where at both ends of the political spectrum, you have people who are way out of the mainstream that served this country extremely well for 80 years after World War II under both Democrats and Republicans.
May I mention just, and I know you've been very patient, I'll be brief. I just wanted to add a footnote. Eliot made me think of this. I also think that, many of the Republicans, and again, I'm looking at elected officials predominantly, I think they were also looking at the results of the election and, how the election came out. And I say that seriously because in this case, I think there was a mood or a sense that most Americans are, again, tired of being brought into wars. And that, where does it stop? Where does the line get drawn here? You mentioned other points about Putin, other things, but now I'm speaking about that piece. And I think that, in that sense, that doesn't mean that many of them are not internationalists, not to have a double negative there, but actually are more cautious about what kinds of programs or efforts that we're going to get galvanized around. And that struck me because, when, the electoral vote, the popular vote, Congress, just all of that. And I think the biggest message was that. That was a very hardcore campaign message. So I think some are also trying to gauge. And it seems, on popular opinion, if you see it, it's shifting. I mean, there are certain issues, tariffs, I see that was one, and then it's moving in another direction. So time will tell, but I'm trying to give an answer to you. At least that's kind of what I see. I myself, I just might identify, I am someone who does believe in strong international engagement, but I do think, and I want to take heed of also this issue, is it in our interests? We were 20 years in Afghanistan. I was very involved with Afghanistan, more so than Iraq. And, I think people were wondering, what were we doing there,
Many of my Ukrainian friends have expressed concern that a peace agreement that is too favorable to Russia will allow space for the Kremlin to simply rearm and try again. I'm hearing similar statements from politicians in Poland and the Baltics about the possibility of a direct confrontation with NATO and Western Europe. But given how mauled the Russian army has been through the last 4 years, what is the reasonable expectation for future territorial aggression from Russia?
So, there's a difference of opinion out there. I think the West Europeans, and to some extent us, tend to think, well, it'll take them 5 years or so to recover. My European trip is going to be to Tallinn, Stockholm, and Warsaw, so that'll be a different take. And the Baltics and the Nordics, in particular, think that have a much greater assessment that the Russians will come back and that they will come for possibly Estonia, which is the easiest one to pick off. Now, they're on the front line, they're more vulnerable, that may be coloring the assessment, but they also have really good intelligence organizations, all of those countries, and very smart people who spend a lot of time looking at this. The old saw about Russia is it's never as strong as you think it is, and it's never as weak as you think it is. And although on the one hand, the Russian army today cannot launch large-scale maneuver warfare, that sort of thing, there has been a lot of adaptation to the new conditions of the battlefield. There is, as there always has been, enormous willingness to accept casualties and suffering, and a lot of persistence. So I think it's an open question. One of the things that we should have learned over the last 25, 30 years is rather than sort of brushing the Baltic states off when they tell us these things, it would be not only more respectful and polite, but actually in our own interest to pay more attention to what they have to say and why.
And remember, I said we should not be in a position where policy-wise that we ignore what Putin says or any Russian leader says. And in this case, he said very unequivocally, and on a number of occasions, remember that the greatest tragedy ever historically was the loss of the Soviet Union. Right. And it's very clear he is on a path to, change that. And he's looking at his own legacy. And so in this case, I think that countries like Poland, which now is ahead of the United States and others on its defense spending, it's close to 5%. Defense spending. Estonia is also in that mix, as well as Lithuania, among others in Europe. So they do take what he says very seriously.
We have 3 more minutes for the last question. We don't? Oh, yeah, please. Yep.
Good afternoon. My name is Jim Trakis. I'm a councilman at large in the City of Independence in Cuyahoga County here. My question to you is related to, we talked a lot about diplomacy, but I wanted to get from a military perspective. I retired after 11 years as a major, so in the reserves. If Putin sidelines the United States, as could happen, can Ukraine throw these guys out of their country? Can they win? What does Europe do if something like that happens? And I believe that you only achieve peace through victory, but want to get your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I think that part of the tragedy of this story is if we had not been so cautious and timid in aiding Ukraine, particularly in the immediate aftermath of the invasion, they might very well have driven the Russians out of, if not all of their territory, a large part of it, because the Russians really were in a state of collapse. You know, if there is no further American aid, what does it mean? That's the $60,000 question. People have now had some time to prepare for this. You are seeing European rearmament, not fast enough, and but there are substantial amounts of money being spent. And the fact that the Ukrainians themselves are actually now a major defense industrial power, that's a big deal. The loss to the Ukraine, I think the most important loss to the Ukrainians would be intelligence cooperation. Because even though you can do an awful lot with overhead imagery, first, the United States can turn some parts of that off, but our intelligence gathering is just like second to none, certainly on the technical side. And with the best will in the world, even the Brits and the French and so on couldn't really fully make up for it. So at the very least, it would make it a lot harder simply for them to hold the line. You know, the hard reality is barring a Russian collapse, which could happen, I don't see them being able to push Russia out of the occupied territories anytime soon. I just don't think militarily that's going to be feasible. But like I said, barring a Russian collapse, which is not inconceivable.
By the way, there was a piece that was written by in the Washington Times by the head of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, and have a moment of forgetting his name. I'm embarrassed, but it's an excellent piece because it talks about peace for the future and what could possibly happen here. In this piece, the author was talking about the Korea armistice, and he brought that back in, and he said, you know, if there is actually a ceasefire, he was citing how, well, we have a ceasefire in Korea, and it's lasted some 70, roughly 70 plus years. So if there is, then, by the way, that would be an opportunity for Ukraine. He was arguing that actually for Russia, he did say in the piece, by the way, he talked about the territories. He said, I don't see the territories, the change. I don't see a change on Crimea. I don't see that NATO right yet. But the but is for Ukraine for going forward and really trying to, in a way that you don't accept, there isn't an end to the war, and there isn't an acceptance of those territories, but it's a conclusion that could possibly be beneficial to Ukraine in this case. So I apologize. I can't believe, maybe I was getting up so early in the morning, I forgot the gentleman's name, and he's a dear friend. But the Washington Times today has a piece on this.
Well, we'll end with the possibility of a beneficial outcome for Ukraine. I feel good ending there. I would like to invite all of you to join me in thanking Eliot Cohen and Paula Dobriansky. So to our audience, I want to say that forums like these are made possible thanks to generous support from individuals just like you. You can learn more about how to become a guardian of free speech at cityclub.org. I am a guardian of free speech, and I would invite all of you in the audience today to consider joining the campaign. No, it matters. Free speech matters. So here we are at the City Club, and today the City Club welcomed guests at tables hosted by Cleveland State University students, David Goldberg and friends of Terry Shmigala, and the United Ukrainian Organizations of Ohio. Also, please be sure to join the City Club on Friday, June 6th at the Mimi Ohio Theater right here in Playhouse Square. City Club will be hosting the Right Honorable Dame Jacinda Ardern, the 40th Prime Minister of New Zealand. She will be reflecting on the struggles, triumphs, and experiences that shaped her leadership style as detailed in her new memoir, A Different Kind of Power. Tickets are available for this and other City Club forums at cityclub.org. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the end of today's forum. Thank you once again very much to Paula Dobriansky and Eliot Cohen. I'm Karina Van Vliet. The forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
The ideas expressed in City Club forums are those of the speakers and not of the City Club of Cleveland, IdeaStream Public Media, or their sponsors. Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream Public Media are made possible by PNC and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.